Hello everyone. In this chapter we're going to talk about different ethical challenges, how to address them, and what ethical decisions to make. Being in health information management, you do face a lot of ethical challenges, whether it's something with your employees or coworkers, a conflict of interest, the connection between coding and reimbursement. And I'd say the biggest one is protecting patients' sensitive information. Okay. We all will have to face an ethical dilemma in our lives at some point, right? Whether it's in your personal life, something in an organization you work for, or a group that can affect other people. And there's not one right answer that's going to apply to every situation, right? The decision's going to vary depending on the factors that influence the decision maker and whatever process they choose to follow. So what we're going to talk about first are some of these influencing factors. What are these things that can influence the decision maker? While one person can rely on a particular ethical concept or theory, like those things we talked about last week, to make a decision, someone else might rely on their religious beliefs. And then another person could rely on a personal experience that they've gone through to make a decision. You can even look at your professional code of ethics to guide you, or a combination of any of these things. Okay. So a big feature of these professional associations that you can join, like a HEMA, is their code of ethics, which is a written list of that profession's values and standards of conduct. Codes of ethics are important because it can show, the broader community what your professional association's basic ethical and moral standards are that the members have to follow. Okay, they do embody a lot of different concepts. One is that the members of the profession differentiate themselves from the broader group of occupations and technical careers out there. They show that you, the professional, is an autonomous, responsible decision maker, not someone who just follows orders. Another thing is that it gives you a sense of loyalty to the patients and your fellow members in the profession. And there's an implied promise that the professional who's governed by this ethical code will not pursue their own interests at the expense of their patient. Okay. So codes of ethics are considered living documents, which means they can change all the time. They started out as more of a statement to limit the competition and to, promote an image that they wanted to portray themselves as. Also to impose restrictions on the members as opposed to what it is now, which is more of a like statements of ethical and moral principles that govern their conduct, how they're supposed to act. Now, almost every professional association has a code of ethics. Okay, so nurses, orthopedic surgeons are going to have one, and pediatricians might have a different one. Okay. There's one for pretty much every physician's specialty, like the American Osteopathic Association or the American Academy of Pediatrics. Okay, so these codes of ethics go over things that the doctors deal with every day, such as what you see listed here: the obligation to give competent medical service, to protect patient confidences, to study and get continued education because things are always evolving in the medical field. Also to recognize that patients have the right to choose their own physician or if they'll undergo treatments, and they cannot discriminate. So just like other professions, health information management has a code of ethics. They've had it since the beginning through AHIMA. The HIM code of ethics is actually in your ebook on page 103 if you want to check it out. But some of the things included are in regards to the ethical obligations to yourself, to the patient, to other members of the healthcare team, so doctors and nurses, to your employer, your peers, the professional association, and then to the public. So codes of ethics aren't effective if they're not widely communicated to all of the members. So it's important to communicate them to the members, to staff, to customers or patients, okay, so that everyone knows what's expected. One of the most effective ways to do this is by professional education, such as training on how to apply the code in the workplace, or focusing more on what the consequences of an unethical behavior would be for them rather than focusing on the wording itself. You can also do like a case-by-case analysis with the employees and have them participate in the discussion. The best way is letting people think critically and think for themselves, right, rather than just repeating the words. Okay, the most effective way to enforce a code of ethics is by using an ethics committee, which is made of people that are members of the organization, and they look at the existing ethics codes and create new ones based on any issues that come up in the workplace. In the healthcare setting, these committees can also consult on bioethical issues, such as taking people off of life support or treating seriously ill newborns, procedures dealing with organ procurement, and new treatments or medical devices. Okay, those are all a little more tricky areas. Okay, so you would think that patients would always have the right and the ability to make decisions in terms of their own treatment. But this concept of patients' rights has only become what it is now in the last like half century or so. The patient used to be looked at as a passive participant in their own treatment, which is crazy to think about. But now we have a lot more control as a patient. But there are still some limitations, such as doctors have to approve you being admitted to the hospital. Insurance is usually requires you to be pre-approved before having a procedure or getting any treatment done. And while we do have a lot of control in choosing who our doctors are, some insurances limit the options you have, right? Who's in network versus out of network. So why have patients' rights become more of a thing? One, because of the rise in not only consumer culture, but education. People started demanding a higher quality of care and more say in their care, right? And second is the move away from paternalism, which is what the doctor, which is when the doctor acted in the role of a father to his children. The doctor would decide what was best for the patient without having to consult them first. So basically giving the patient their diagnosis and then only telling them the treatment they want to do, not giving them any of the other options. Okay, so thankfully we now have more rights as patients, and we can make these decisions on receiving treatment or not on our own. The American Hospital Association publicized the Patient's Bill of Rights in the 1970s. That's purpose was to let patients know, like, hey, you have the right to privacy, to confidentiality, to informed consent. Okay. They later added things to do with the physician's responsibilities to their patients. It's currently referred to as the Patient Care Partnership. And while it still emphasizes patients' rights, it also explains, like what you can expect during a hospital stay, how you can express any concerns you have over your care. Okay. So patient rights are usually looked at from an ethical point of view, but they can also be viewed from a legal context. Some states have made statutes relating to patient rights, which means, failing to honor a patient's rights goes from being an ethical breach to a legal breach that can result in penalties enforced by law. One of the most successful efforts in making this a legal issue is the Federal Patient Self-Determination Act, which was passed by Congress to help ensure patients have the right to determine the extent of their care, to make advance directives, that hospitals have to inform patients of their rights, and that they have to have like policies and procedures in place about that as well. Another example of granting patients' rights at the federal level is HIPAA, which does, all the confidentiality and protecting your sensitive information, but also goes over several rights for patients in regards to their health information. So under HIPAA, patients have a right to access, inspect and maintain copies of their PHI, which, if you remember, PHI is protected health information. They have the right to being notified of the privacy practices, to have limited use or limited disclosure of their PHI. They can request that there are steps taken to keep communication confidential. They can request an accounting of disclosed PHI, like who has their PHI been released to. And they can file a complaint concerning privacy practices. Okay, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, or ARA, is another federal law passed by Congress that says patients have the right to get a copy of their records in electronic format if the facility they were treated in uses an electronic health record. Okay, so it used to be, they would have to print out just copies, right? But now you can get it burned onto a disk or on a flash drive or something like that. Okay. Now, of course, other factors that could influence someone would be religious beliefs, advances in science and technology, and then legal factors. Okay. And you can read those things here. All right, so again, we have this graphic that doesn't really make sense. Just, different aspects of the ethical decision-making process. Not really sure why it's done like this, but there are 9 steps in the ethical decision-making process. The first 4 are to clearly define the issue, determine the facts of the situation, okay, everything that is going on, okay. Who are the stakeholders? What values are at stake? And what obligations and what are the obligations and interests of each stakeholder? And then to determine what options are available and evaluate them. So when evaluating your options, you can compare each one against an ethical theory. So either utilitarianism, which option would be best for the greatest good of the most people, or deontology, which option supports doing your duty or social equality and justice, which option promotes the rights and dignity of everyone. Okay. So after weighing each option, step 5 is that the decision maker has to make a decision and act upon it, which is not always easy, right? This chart kind of offers some guidance for choosing the course of action. And are there any analogous situations, which just means like similar situations? And if there was, what did they do in that situation? What was the outcome? Are there any legal implications? What makes the most sense? And if we do this option, will it stand up to scrutiny? Like meaning in a lawsuit. And then feelings, can you sleep at night with this choice? Okay. Back to the steps. So 6 would be justify the decision and give your reasoning for, why you chose that one. 7 would be actually implementing the decision. 8 is evaluate the outcome of the decision. Did what you thought would happen actually happen? And then the last one is to examine how to prevent the issue from happening again. Okay, so pretty basic steps, but you can use this process if you're ever in like an ethical dilemma where you need to make a decision. So yeah, okay, moving on to ethical challenges. So these are situations that don't have a clear-cut right answer, and the person has to make a decision between two or more not perfect alternatives. This usually is over just general conflicts in the workplace, like an argument between two people, a conflict between, the obligations of one person and then the rights of another, or some combination of these. One of the biggest ethical challenges that you may face in the workplace is a conflict of interest, which is the clash between, your selfish interests, and your obligation to your organization or the group. Okay. This would exist if you use your position within the organization to promote your own interests, or the interests of like your family or friends, even if it's not the best for your organization. Okay. So for example, if your company needs a vendor that does, I don't know, makes copies, and you have a relative that does copies, but it's actually not the cheapest option for your company, choosing your relative's company would be considered a conflict of interest because it would actually be cheaper for your work to use a different company. Okay, that's a very basic example. A conflict of interest can be potential, which means it gives the appearance of harm or impropriety without the harm actually happening. And the example of that would be accepting favors from a vendor, even if you don't choose that vendor. From the outside, it could look like you're favoring them. So it would be a potential conflict of interest. Another potential one is having a second job with a competitor of your organization. It just doesn't look good. Even if you're not doing anything wrong, you're just working for these two organizations. Okay. Another ethical concern is substance abuse in the workplace. So someone that can't function properly because of alcohol or drugs is referred to as an impaired colleague. So one perspective is to have a no tolerance policy and basically, fire the employee if they're found guilty of substance abuse. The other perspective is to view it as a disease and to try to support this person with a rehab program, and then allow them to come back to their job if they complete it. Another ethical challenge is disparagement, which is the belittling or criticizing of the skills, knowledge, or qualifications of another professional. So this is included in most codes of ethics. It's considered professional misconduct. So this doesn't mean if someone is doing something wrong that you can't address, your concerns in the correct way. It means you can't use like personal attacks on someone or someone's skills. Okay, so while the three challenges we just talked about probably don't happen on a regular basis, truth-telling seems to be one that happens daily in most workplaces. And it doesn't mean just lying to your coworker or supervisor. It could also be deceptive advertising, okay? Like a governmental agency not disclosing all the information that a reporter requests, or a business not disclosing to the government everything that is required by state. Even copying your coworker's work, especially if you're taking credit for it. All those things can be considered unethical practices and lead to the erosion of trust, right? People aren't going to trust you after doing something like that. Okay, a supervisor has three main ethical roles in an organization. First is being a role model, so setting a good example for their employees, not doing things that could look like a conflict of interest, and accepting responsibility for your mistakes. Second is encouraging ethical behavior by talking about the ethical standards and enforcing them fairly, and also making sure that you're following that set of standards yourself. You can also use rewards and punishment to kind of influence behavior. And the third role is monitoring employee conduct. So making sure the employees are following all the policies and procedures, or specifically talking about ethics in their performance evaluations. Okay, some of these healthcare challenges we've already talked about, but a conflict of interest in the healthcare field could be a doctor investing in a facility that offers physical therapy or diagnostic imaging or something, but doesn't treat patients there. Instead, he refers all of his patients there. So when the facility bills for all the treatment, he's then profiting from it. Okay, another example would be a doctor having a relationship with his patient. Okay, now substance abuse and impaired colleagues. Obviously, that would be a huge risk to patient safety if a nurse or someone in immediate patient care is under the influence at work. A financial conflict of interest would be when a third-party insurance company says they'll only pay for 2 days in a hospital stay when the doctor thinks they need 4 days, so they discharge the patient early so they don't have to pay out of pocket. But the patient's still too sick to go home, okay? That would be a financial conflict of interest. As far as bioethical issues, there are ethical challenges in things involving like human test subjects or who to give organs to for transplant. We'll actually talk more about that bioethical issues next week. And lastly, there can also be ethical challenge with the electronic health record. Copy and pasting information either in the same patient record or copying something and putting it in another patient's record just to like save time really presents a risk being made. Presents, the risk of making a mistake, okay? So you never want to copy and paste in an EHR. Okay, as the HIM field has changed over time, new challenges have come up such as changes in the healthcare environment, requirements for documentation and access to and release of information, and then developments in technology, including the ease of sharing information electronically. Okay, and then the last thing is changes in reimbursement systems and their coding systems. There's always the pressure for maximum reimbursement for the facility. So some coders may have trouble choosing between coding more accurately versus coding to get more money for the hospital. The AHIMA Code of Standards, or Standards for Ethical Coding, is a good guide that covers all the gray areas also. There could also be the pressure to like fudge statistics to make it look like all the requirements are met when they might not be, just in order to meet accreditation. And then making sure you're appropriately handling sensitive information like genetic information about adoptions or behavioral health. Okay, and that is all I have for you today. I hope y'all have a great week.